topic that impacts everyone in Maryland, the budget.
The bar for me for raising taxes is very, very high.
After some mid-year money moves, I'm questioning Governor Wes Moore about what he changed and what could be coming next.
Could we see more of those targeted user and fee increases next year?
Hearing the biggest criticism from state Republicans.
Our spending trajectory isn't sustainable.
And going in depth on how the state is spending your tax dollars. Thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Each week, I'll be taking a deep dive into the issues that matter most to you. Today, the focus is on Maryland's budget. The state is currently facing a multi-billion-dollar deficit. Some Republican lawmakers worry the governor is not doing enough to cut spending, but rather focusing on big-ticket projects. Two of those projects are the Redline and the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, or the state's education spending plan. Each of those projects would cost the state billions of dollars. Money critics say the state does not have right now. This year's budget included increased taxes and fees to try and offset some of that spending, but some worry widespread tax increases could be necessary next year. Maryland House Minority Leader Jason Buckle will join us live to talk about those concerns and criticisms in just a few moments. Just weeks ago, the governor reallocated nearly $150 million to cover Medicaid and child care costs. The changes do not address the deficit concerns. Let's take a closer look at those changes. Mid-year money moves approved in July. At Governor Wes Moore's direction, the Board of Public Works approving $148 million in budget shifts. $26 million cut from the health department. $12 million of that slated to go to local health departments around the state. Raises for public defenders off the table.
It is unfathomable how OPD can appear on the list.
Drone security for the Port of Baltimore on pause. $19 million cut from the University System of Maryland, and more.
My administration did not come to these decisions lightly, by any stretch of the imagination.
Governor Moore argues that cuts are necessary to offset the rising and unexpected cost of the state's child care scholarship program and Medicaid. The governor says more than 1.7 million Marylanders are enrolled in Medicaid, and the child care scholarship program has increased 70% since he took office.
That means an additional 16,000 kids.
Both programs, according to the Moore administration, are core priorities and can help boost the economy.
Allows their parents and caregivers to be able to join the workforce, because we cannot be a state where we're asking people to make a choice between taking care of your children or joining the workforce.
While the governor and his team call this a budget cut, the move doesn't actually trim the state's $63 billion budget. While the Governor Moore held off some Democrats calling for more widespread tax hikes during this last legislative session, there were some fee and tax hikes. The budget shuffling comes amid a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall in the future. The pricey Blueprint for Maryland's Future education spending plan and the planned Redline public transit line in Baltimore City.
Our spending trajectory isn't sustainable.
House Minority Leader Jason Buckle says the governor's plans don't answer questions about what's coming next. But growing the economy is something both sides of the aisle seem to agree on accomplishing. How to meet that goal is where the partisan divides often grow, and lawmakers continue to stare down a deficit in the years to come, while Marylanders are left to wonder, will lawmakers look to them to foot the bill? Now, when Governor Wes Moore originally rolled out his this year's $63 billion budget, he said he wanted to avoid tax hikes. But the final version of the budget did include increased revenue from some taxes and fees. Some of those changes include raising the state's vehicle excise tax and repealing the trade-in allowance exemption. The state also increased registration fees for certain vehicles and added a $125 electric vehicle surcharge. Lawmakers added a 75-cent fee on ride shares like Uber and Lyft and increased the tobacco tax. Altogether, the plan totals about $350 million in additional tax revenue, plus $80 million in new fees. I took some of those big questions about how the state will pay for these big priorities, especially while trying to pinch pennies, to Governor Wes Moore. I questioned him if these budget constraints will really mean more taxes for Marylanders. Governor Wes Moore touts his big priorities: expanding child care options, improving education, growing the economy, and expanding public transit.
So what's your plan to pay for some of these top priorities that we've heard come from you and other Democrats in the State House?
Well, it's important for people to understand why we made some decisions that we made and the tough decisions that were made. You know, the business model for Maryland has not worked. Where we've watched over the 7 years before I became the governor, that the budget for the state of Maryland increased by 70%. I mean, it exploded. And during the same time period, we saw how GDP and growth within our state essentially stayed flat. Maryland grew by 3%. The average state grew by 11% during that time period. So we were spending more, we just were not earning more.
The governor doubling down on a familiar line for Marylanders. He says fiscal discipline is key.
How we're thinking about this work. We're going to invest in things that we think are going to create measurements of long-term growth, continue to drive unemployment low in a way that it needs to be driven, and continue to incentivize business and business creation and entrepreneurship, and making this a very business-friendly environment in a way that historically it has not been. But also, we're going to be disciplined.
So could we see more of those targeted user and fee increases next year?
I think it's too early to say what exactly that we're going to do together, both Democrat and Republican, to continue passing a bipartisan balanced budget. And so I take that responsibility really seriously. So our ability to be able to really drill in and take a fine-tooth comb to this budget and know that, you know, for the past couple of years, at least since I've been the governor, we actually have been able to decrease the size of state government. The first time that has happened in over a decade. We did it 2 years in a row. We passed a bipartisan balanced budget for 2 years in a row. And at the same time, we were able to do it and not raise sales taxes or personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, state property taxes. So we were able to do those things in a really important measurement. But I think we have to have that same measure of discipline as we're thinking about this work going forward.
We've heard from a lot of local leaders raise concerns about funding the blueprint. Do you anticipate making changes to the out years in terms of the responsibility and contributions that are required by these local jurisdictions?
I believe in the tenets of the blueprint. I believe that we need to make sure we have a world-class education system. And so the truth is we've got work to do because we're not there right now. And while I believe in making sure that we have a world-class education system, we've got to be able to work together to create an actual plan to be able to implement it. Because right now, there are real challenges in being able to get that done and get it done in a way that the locals and the state and every other partner who's involved sees that taking place. So there have to be adjustments.
So you say that you believe in the tenants and there needs to be adjustments, but what does that actually look like? Does that mean extending the timeline for this so that the price per year is reduced? Do you have any details for what that could actually look like?
I think all options need to be on the table.
Governor Moore says he's confident in the new state superintendent, Dr. Carrie Wright, to help usher in a new era of education and blueprint implementation across Maryland.
Her ability to be able to move forward in a really prompt, but also a really data-driven way about how we're thinking about the science of reading and how we're thinking about making sure that our kids are getting the basic fundamentals of reading and writing and arithmetic and the arts that they need.
The blueprint was passed when Democrats in the General Assembly overrode a veto from then Governor Larry Hogan.
We now have an administration who believes in public education and who believes in making sure that public education should be supported and should be funded. However, we've got to make sure we have a plan that has buy-in and has a plan that has a feasible financial pathway. And that's the work we got to do.
Can you assure Marylanders right now that they would not see a widespread sales tax increase, corporate tax increase next year?
I think Marylanders should pay attention to what we have done before. And what I've said is that the bar for me for raising taxes is very, very high. For me, taxes is not an ideology. And so I think the people of our state can have a real sense of confidence that that everything that we are going to do, it is going to be data-driven. And I take fiscal responsibility deeply, deeply seriously, not just in this role, but before I ran for office in the first place.
Governor Moore, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Maryland Republican lawmakers pushing back on the governor's claims about the budget, saying Maryland needs to cut spending to avoid more tax and free increases. House Minority Leader Jason Buckle will join us live with Republicans' concerns. And as we head to break, we're also taking a look at some of today's headlines.
Baltimore City's health commissioner, Dr. Ihuoma Emenyagua's abrupt firing this week left the city council blindsided. After just 7 months on the job, a source of our partners at the Baltimore Sun say Emenyagua was let go after becoming the subject of an investigation from the Baltimore office of the Inspector General into her work at a clinic while serving in her role as commissioner.
There have been no indications that there had been something afoot, but apparently there is something else going on.
Inside these doors, you can see the black, burnt remnants of an overnight fire at the Commodore John Rogers Elementary and Middle. Michelle lives near the school and says she saw it.
Why? I mean, it's a school.
She says the school has been empty for about a year. Based on this presentation from Baltimore City Schools back in May, demolition was supposed to happen this past spring, and construction was supposed to start in the summer. A $66 million project transforming the school into this. But now it's August.
The president celebrated with the families of now freed prisoners. They're part of a group of 16 people being released from Russia and heading to the U.S. and Germany. Russia is getting 8 people back in the deal, including ones with ties to Russian intelligence and hacking.
It was a gut punch.
The news isn't good. I mean, I cannot deal with a $40 million increase in my education budget next year.
We're struggling.
I've got counties on the Eastern Shore that have said for the entire time since Kerwin has been passed that they cannot afford it.
Maryland's education spending plan, known as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, is a huge item in the budget. The law pumps $30 billion additional tax dollars into public education statewide over the first 10 years, and then $4 billion additional dollars every year after that. Project Baltimore's Chris Papps has been following the blueprint for years. He joins us now. Thanks for being here, Chris. We've heard concerns from some local jurisdictions about the proposal, but is this plan really feasible realistically?
Well, many jurisdictions do support increasing the amount of money they're putting into public education, but those increases that are coming from Kerwin are going to have to happen so quickly that those school systems are going to have to make some pretty tough budget decisions, which would include, as we have seen over the past couple months, some schools cutting programs or even teacher positions.
So how would school systems actually use this funding once it gets to them?
So you mentioned that the school systems are getting a lot more funding. Well, a lot of that money is mandated on how they have to spend it, which is one of the issues that a lot of the jurisdictions have. So they have the money, but they have to put it in certain places, and they have to find other places to get it to. So some of the things that it does is that it increases teacher salaries, it increases the number of vo-tech programs that would be in schools, and also full-day pre-K, expands pre-K. That is one of the biggest budget items. The other one is the teacher salaries. By 2026, the minimum starting teacher salary in Maryland is going to have to be about $60,000. That's a huge price tag.
And we know that we have seen similar efforts done in the past, right? We saw this when lawmakers passed the Thornton education plan. But how is Blueprint different than other spending proposals that the state has tried?
Yeah, so Thornton was about 22, 23 years ago. Now, they're the same in that they were both massive increases in spending. The Thornton plan and also the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, known as the Kerwin plan. Massive increases in spending. What's different, lawmakers say, about the Blueprint is that there's supposed to be more accountability and there's supposed to be more transparency in how that money is spent. We're 3 years into this, about 3.5 years into this bill. We got about 6.5 years left before it's supposed to be fully implemented. You know, these next 6 years are going to be pretty difficult years for the state as far as education, local school systems understanding how that money is spent, and is there actually going to be more accountability and transparency? And we'll find out.
We'll find out, especially when it comes to if lawmakers actually decide to make some changes to how this plan is implemented in the out years. Chris Papps from Project Baltimore, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the blueprint is not the only expensive project that could strain the state's budget. Governor Wes Moore reviving the Redline project, confirming plans for a light rail stretching east to west across Baltimore City. Former Governor Larry Hogan defunded the project back in 2015 because of concerns over the price tag. There is not an exact price for the project now this time, but experts estimate it could cost upwards of $4 billion. Taxpayer advocate David Williams says the state simply cannot afford it.
Even though the initial projection is $4 billion, it's going to cost more than that. Every infrastructure project, every construction project always goes over budget. So this is going to cost Maryland taxpayers and federal taxpayers a lot of money. And it's money Maryland doesn't have.
Maryland Republicans have been outspoken in their criticism of projects like the Blueprint and the Redline, and have also pushed back on the governor's assertions that he has not raised taxes, calling the fee increases new taxes. Joining me now live is Maryland House Minority Leader Jason Buckle. Thanks for joining us. I want to get right to some of the meat of this. The governor says the budget was passed with Republican support, yet we often hear the minority party criticize those taxes and fees. How do you respond to this back and forth?
So, the budget is a top line number. There are literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of individual spending decisions that are made within the framework of our $63 billion budget. I don't think sometimes a lot of people in the real world understand that's what our budget is. That's $63 billion with a B. I think people generally will support the budget, not always, but generally because on balance, they think, hey, there are a lot of important things being spent for public safety, for roads, for transportation, for capital investments in communities from one end of the state to the other. You can still say, hey, I can support the overall spending number of the budget. What I can't support is the way that we're getting there. And some of the way we're getting there, we didn't balance last year's budget with $300 and some million in increased fees. That's coming next year. Those fees are coming in as years go by. And so it's almost as if the Moore administration and their allies in Annapolis are preparing us for the inevitable, which is we just need more money. We're voracious as to what they want to spend. There's never any limitation to it. And Republicans almost uniformly are opposed to it. We cannot balance these future budgets. We have over $1 billion cash deficit for next for the budget that we'll work on in the 2025 session. It goes up to over $3 billion in a few years. As you've seen for most of your program, I've been listening to it. So much of that is driven by the Blueprint. And that's not counting the Redline. That's in a separate budget called the Transportation Trust Fund budget, which is $3 to $4 billion underfunded. And we want to go have a new light rail system, which we all know we can't afford. And so, we look at it as, I appreciate it. I listened to Governor Moore's comments that he just made a few minutes ago. It's the first time I've ever heard a leading Democrat in Maryland say, I don't think we might be able to really afford the Blueprint. At least that's what I took Governor Moore's remarks to be, and we're going to have to address that. That's the first time anybody said that. I'm not sure how his colleagues in Annapolis will feel about that, because not one of them has ever stepped out of line from the Blueprint so far.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. Obviously, you and I have had many conversations about funding during the legislative session. And speaking of Blueprint, I thought it was a big deal that he said that he believes that there needs to be adjustments made to the implementation in these out years. And going back to you and everyone else in Annapolis come January when the session begins, what exactly do you think that could look like in terms of those conversations?
I think we have to decide what are the key parts of the Blueprint that are really mission critical. I serve on the education committee that deals with public education. We dealt very much with the Kerwin plan. There are parts of it that I support. We need more vocational education in our to prepare people for 21st century careers that aren't going to get a four-year college degree. We need more services for children with special needs and learning disabilities. We need to basically have that top-flight education system. But a lot of the things we did in the Blueprint, I'm not sure how they're going to correlate. So I think what we really need to do is get honest about what is mission critical, where is the spending that it has to go, as opposed to where we'd like it to go. Do we need full-time pre-K for 3-year-olds? in the state of Maryland, basically creating an entire new grade that your children are going to go to public school, cradle to grave from 3 to 18. I don't know that we need that. I don't know that we need to mandate that and all the costs. Do we need every teacher in every school in very diverse communities? You know, making $60,000 a year as a young teacher, as your correspondent just indicated, in Montgomery County and Howard County, that's not, you know, quite a bit of money. In other counties, in Somerset County, in Western Maryland, where I live, it's certainly not getting rich, but it is a very solid salary. Maybe we need to not have the one-size-fits-all approach to some of these things. So we have to get honest about what is mission critical of the blueprint for the kids. Not for the adults, for the kids.
It certainly sounds like we are going to be in for a possibly contentious session come January, with the blueprint conversation happening at the same time as dealing with some of the other budget constraints for all of the other projects, including the Redline, like you talked about, which I know we haven't really had a full-scale conversation about how that would actually be implemented. Right. But some of your colleagues last year in the House at least proposed bigger, wider spread tax increases. Oh, yeah. Those were shot down. And I've heard from people who argued that that was simply just a primer to really get the conversation started with the anticipation of coming back next year and moving on some of them. So give us your take. Yeah. What do you think will be in store for come January in terms of potentially wider spread tax and fee increases?
The committee I serve in also deals with all the taxes. So we sort of get to, you know, they spend the money on education and we also deal with all the taxes. So we get very familiar with these things. I think that that's fair. I think people believe that some of these very aggressive taxation ideas on businesses, on companies, on sales taxes, they think that it takes years and years and years, and eventually voters and citizens and the media, it just sort of, you become numb to. You know, oh, gee, every year they say they're going to pass $1 billion in tax increases, but they never do. Yeah. And then all of a sudden we get to late March, April, one year in a session, and no one really thinks it's going to happen, and whoopsie, there you go. We have to avoid that. People have to be diligent. Our caucus is absolutely committed. Every member of our caucus, I think, is committed to fight that. But there are people in Annapolis, people who I like personally, they're smart people. They honestly, firmly believe that if you just tax the heck out of everybody, we'll have plenty of money. And the one thing you learn when you deal with tax policy, McKinsey, state taxes and state tax policy is different than federal tax policy. If feds in DC raise your taxes for a company, where's the company going to? Are they going to move to Spain? Are they going to move to China or Zimbabwe? Probably not. Some of them do, but they have all these costs. When you raise your state taxes on your earners, on your small businesses, on your corporate job creators, it's really easy to go to Virginia. Yeah. It's really easy to go to North Carolina, Florida, and that's what's been happening. Governor Moore just said it. Our economy, our population, our private sector is not growing enough to pay for what, you know, Democrats in Annapolis want to pay for. We want to have all these services, all these government employees, the best of the best and everything. That costs money, and you can't take it out of the middle class. You can't take it out of the working class. You can't take it out of small businesses over and over and over again. And I think that's going to be the big fight for the next probably year to 2 years.
Definitely. All right, we're going to have to end this conversation now, but hopefully we can pick it up again because very critical information and topics. Minority Leader Jason Buckle, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we can talk again.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Have a good night.
Thanks. This week we asked if you're willing to spend more in taxes for projects like the Redline. Hundreds of you weighed in on social media. We'll be sure to take a look at some of your responses right after this. This week we asked if you're willing to pay more taxes for projects like the Redline, and we got hundreds of responses. I want to show you just a few of them. First, let's take a look at this person, Bob, who says, yes, we need more mass transit. The days of cars containing one person are over, and then the rest of the people are saying no, doesn't ever stop. The tax burden is already ridiculous. All right, that's all the time we have for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Mary?
I'm Mary Bubala. Thank you for watching. Here's another video for you to watch. Also take some time to subscribe to our YouTube channel.